Today we're going to be in the book of Esther. We're going to finish up the first chapter talking about what happened between Queen Vashti and King Ahasuerus. What kind of issue did the queen's actions create? And what was Ahasuerus, the king's reaction to them? And we're going to be looking at that and I hope learn an important Bible study lesson when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. Today I'm with Sherry Mangrum, and Sherry and I are going to continue our series in the book of Esther. In fact, we're just setting some foundation verses. We're going to be doing from verse 8 down to the rest of chapter 1 today. And we're really seeing the establishment of a foundation of the circumstances that set Esther up as the queen, that God is really showing his sovereignty over the situation. And we're really looking at examining from the perspective of an eyewitness. Remember last week we talked about all the details that we saw in the first 7 verses of the chapter. And now we're going to look at verse 8 on down. This is when Vashti, the queen, is showing her stubbornness, or I've heard some people say this is when Vashti is not willing to humiliate herself, and there's all kinds of things. But what this section covers today, as we talk about this, is really what happened to Queen Vashti, the details of what happened. And we're going to look at that as we go along. Is that okay with you, Sherry?
Yes.
All right, let's start. And I'm going to read the first couple of verses so that you don't have to. And let's look at these together real quick. Starting at verse 9. Now, remember that this was at the end of a big party, an official government conference that King Ahasuerus had called for all of his princes through all of the kingdom. And they had this conference for 180 days, for 6 months, with a party at the end that lasted a week. Now, we saw that last week, and now we're going to get into verse 9, and I want to see, as we go through this, Sherry, you and I are going to look at some details, and I want your opinion as a woman and as a Bible student for what you see in these verses. So let me read the first 2 verses. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry, okay, maybe he was drunk. But if you look at verse 8, it says the drinking was done according to the law. And so he was probably feeling really good with all the wine and partying he'd been doing. Whether he was really slovenly drunk, we don't know.
Okay.
But it just doesn't say. It says the heart of the king was merry. This is the end of the banquet. Now look, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded his eunuchs, and these are named by name: Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abathka, Zethar, and Carchzas, whatever. I did my best. Okay, the 7 eunuchs who served the presence of the king. These were his personal eunuchs, okay? Now, let me go on to the next verse, and I want us to observe something here. We notice in verse 9, when the queen is addressed in the story, it's Queen Vashti, right? Now, I went through all of the rest of the chapters and said, let's look at what she's called. And through this whole chapter, she's called Queen Vashti until she disobeys the king. And then she's called Vashti. And so we're going to see that as we go through here. But he sends his eunuchs to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and princes, for she was beautiful. Now, I want to stop right here. What do you see in verse 10? What do you see there? Do you make any observations?
It's interesting that he sent 7 eunuchs.
All right. What's
When it says
what's
her
the
royal
significance? How come he didn't just send one, or just, hey, send a message to Queen that I want to see her? Why do you think it's mentioned in detail? All 7 of the personal presents of the king, all 7 of them were sent to the queen. What do you think the significance is of that?
To me, that would bring out how important the king thought this was to him.
Okay, this is an official act.
It's his pride and joy.
Okay, now look at verse 4. Let's look at the purpose of this conference and this party. Look at verse 4.
Yeah, and he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days.
180 days. So the purpose of this conference was really to show his kingship and the glory of his court to all of his governors, all of his princes, right?
Right.
So then he has this party, and and we know that Vashti had a party for the women. We're going to see that in a second. But this is the crowning moment of his party, was to bring her out because she was beautiful. So she is a trophy wife that the king is summoning her, officially summoning her for a royal appearance. Now, how do I know it was a royal appearance? Instead of just saying, hey, come on down and join the party there, Vashti, and I want to show you off. How do I know it was a royal appearance?
These are the eunuchs who served in the presence of the king.
Okay.
Yes.
And verse 11.
To bring Queen Vashti before the king and her royal crown.
Okay, you pay attention to that?
Yeah.
Now, listen, Sherry, we got to be careful when we're studying the Bible as 21st century people. We need to be careful not to bring our American sensibilities and our American values into the Bible study. You need to read the Bible for what it actually says and what it would be saying to the people that were reading it. The principles of Scripture we bring to ourselves. But we got to be careful not to judge the circumstances using our culture, our rule of thought. All right?
Yeah.
So when we see this, and it says he was merry in drink. So he was feeling very good about himself with the drink. Maybe he was drunk. But he officially beckons Vashti, Queen Vashti, to come. And this wasn't to dance naked in front of the men or any of that stuff, because he beckoned her to come with her royal crown. So she is being called to a state meeting. This is
in other words, she's beckoned to be on her best behavior, look her best.
Because she is representing, yes, she's beautiful, and he's showing the glory of his court and the fact that he's got a beautiful wife, but she is being beckoned to an official court function as the queen of the empire. This would be like the king beckoning, come for a majestic imperial appearance. And I think that's the key in that little phrase. She was called to come with her crown.
Yeah, I see that.
So we see This is really a state. Let's go back to the verses here. This is with her royal crown. This is an official act to display her beauty to the people. She's being invited by the entire servant staff to come to the king as an official act of state. She's coming to show off her glory and the glory of the king for having such a beautiful wife. Yes, she's a trophy wife, but she's being summoned for an official act. Now, it says, verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. Then the king became very angry and his wrath burned within him. Now, one thing that I see in verse 12 is the queen refuses to come. For when she's beckoned, she is commanded by the king. Now, this is the king. His word is law. He is overall, and all of his princes are here. And he gives a command for the appearance of his queen to appear as an act of state. And she refuses. And one of the things that I noticed, Sherry, and I want you to comment on this, that she refuses to come, but it doesn't give any details on why. It doesn't give us any glimpse of what was her attitude, what were her reasons. It doesn't give us any of that. Because that's, number one, that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is the circumstances that bring about Esther's gain to the throne. So it's interesting here that it's really not important to the writer why she doesn't. So what is important to the writer is the fact that she refused to obey a direct command of the king. So this would be, I want you to come for a royal appearance, and no, I'm not going to do it. And what was the king's reaction? He became angry and he became furious in his wrath. So he was extremely angry. But what do we see the actions that he took because of his anger? Let's go back. Then the king said to the wise men, so he's really angry. He could have said, off with their head, and they would have obeyed him. But even though he is super angry, he goes to the court. Look what it says. The king said to the wise men who understood the times, for it was the custom of the king, so to speak, before all who knew law and justice. So even though he's really mad, he wants to do things according to the law, the same way they were drinking at the party, remember?
Yes.
So the king said to the wise men who understood the times and were close to him, and then it names them. So these 7 princes of Persia and Media who had access, all the princes were there from all over the province. But these 7 guys were the supreme court of the kingdom. Do you see that there? These were specialists in the law and justice.
Yeah, it brings out that they sat in the first place in the kingdom.
Right.
So
now,
they
look at, according to that, look at verse 15. Read verse 15.
According to law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs.
Okay, so he is extremely angry, but the place he goes is he goes to the court. Now, if this was just between a husband and wife, he would be furious and he would go home and he would be angry with her. But this isn't. This is an official court appearance, and she refuses to obey the king's command. So he goes to the supreme court of the kingdom and says, what should be done? What does the law say about the way she's acting as queen? Remember again the title, Queen Vashti. Do you see that?
I do.
So now we need to be careful, because I know a ton of women who have taught this, that she is refusing because of her dignity, and she doesn't want to just be shown off, and she's refusing to bow down to his drunken desires.
But if that was the case, wouldn't she want to go? She would want royal crown.
I wouldn't go because he just wants to show me off and he's drunk, and I wouldn't go. That's this. We got to be careful not to study the Bible with our sensibilities added on. So I just want to watch this. You got to be careful not to say, I want my women's rights in here. This is Persia. This is a men's culture. Now let's watch what happens, and watch what Ahasuerus does. He says, according to the law, I just haven't lost my temper. I want to do this correctly. So he goes to the Supreme Court and he says, now the king gave a command and she refused to do. What does the law say that she refuses? Now let's read this together and go through this, because I think it's significant. This represented this breach of royal protocol, created a national crisis. Now, I want to look at the word all as we go through this. In the presence of the king and the princes, Memucan said, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also all the princes and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of the king. Now, you notice what he's saying? Her refusal wasn't just a personal slap to the king. There's a crisis because it was a slap to the royal duties. It was a slap against all of the princes, all of the people in all of the provinces. Do you see that?
Yes.
So her lack of respect for the government process, her lack of decorum for the royal court, caused this crisis, and the Supreme Court is saying there's a problem. And it says in verse 17, for the queen's conduct, this is them talking again, not the king, the queen's conduct will become known to all women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands, saying, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in his presence, but she did not come. This day the ladies of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's conduct, will speak in the same way to all the king's princes, and there will be plenty of contempt and anger. So one of the things they were concerned about was there would be social unrest
Yeah,
in the entire country.
Yeah.
There would be a societal upheaval. Now, yes, between men and their wives, yes. But we got to be careful here. This is a kingdom, and Ahasuerus is trying to do things according to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says the queen has really set a very dangerous precedent for the kingdom. And it could be socially upheaving for the kingdom. And then they go this, and I'm going to read to the end now. If it pleases the king, this is still the Supreme Court talking. If it pleases the king, let a royal edict. So this is not the king's wrath. This is a governmental edict, right? Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Okay. Let a royal edict be issued by him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be repealed, that Vashti, now notice here, the Supreme Court does not refer to her as Queen Vashti. Now it's just Vashti. It says, let it be a law and not repealed, that Vashti may no longer come into the presence of King Ahasuerus. She's lost her royal privilege, and let the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she.
And that stands out a lot more against the backdrop of no longer come in the presence of King Ahasuerus. The queen title being taken away, really, that really pops out at you.
Yeah, because she had basically refused a royal appearance with her crown, representing the kingdom and representing the king. So therefore, she was going to lose the privileges of representing the king as the queen. So you see this is a very legal proceeding leading to a new law that the queen had lost her position, and they were going to look for somebody who was going to be more worthy than she. Now, one of the things that strikes me is I am so glad that when God calls on me to represent him as the King of Heaven, and I don't do it, I'm really glad that the King of Heaven, God, doesn't react this way and say, I'm going to find somebody more worthy and you're kicked out.
Yes.
So I thought, I'm really glad God doesn't treat us the way Ahasuerus is treating Vashti. But he's not being mean to her. He's being legal.
Yeah, it wasn't about him being mean.
See, and so often, Sherry, I have heard this taught where he's in a temper tantrum and he's being very personal and vindictive and taking it out on poor Queen Vashti, who didn't feel like being displayed. But you see how it really becomes pretty evident. This was a royal governmental function that she refused to do her role as the queen.
With all of the details that they gave in the verses before it, if you read it in that context, there's lots of details in that as well. As much detail as it is in the beginning.
Now, if you say, wait a minute, there's no details about why Vashti did what she did. What were her motivations? And that doesn't matter, because as far as the law was concerned, he was summoned by the king to perform a royal representation of the court. And
so
she
at
refused.
This point, it wasn't about husband and wife.
Exactly.
It was about king and queen.
This is a legal issue. That's why he goes to the Supreme Court. And that's why the Supreme Court says, well, wait a minute, there are ramifications that would affect the entire kingdom here.
Mm-hmm.
So there needs to be a law to protect the kingdom. Do you see that?
Yeah.
This is where we got to be careful not to, oh, poor Vashti and all this stuff. Let's read what the Bible actually says and what they would have perceived when they read this. The author is really communicating the fact that Ahasuerus really reacted pretty well. He reacted as a king and not as a husband.
Yeah.
He reacted and said, I got to go to the Supreme Court and find out what the wise men have to say about what we should do here. Let's finish this out. 20, it says, when the king's edict, which he will make, is heard throughout all his kingdom, and this is the government, great as it is, then all women will give honor to their husbands. So this is, again, is a societal concern. This is a kingdom-wide concern to give honor to their husbands, great and small, whether they're kings or whether they're princes or whether they're just Joe Blow. This will establish a social structure for the kingdom.
That's pretty important.
Yeah. Now, verse 21 says, this word pleased the king and the princes. Now, look at that. This was a pleasing decision to the government of the day. The king, yes, but also it was pleasing to the princes. And the king did as Memucan proposed. So he sent letters to all, remember that's all the king's provinces. So this is kingdom wide, to each province according to its script, and to every people, that's all, to all people according to their language. The kingdom was huge. We saw that last week. We saw that map. And everyone who speaks in the language of his own people, this was a law for all men in the kingdom. And this would be pleasing to them. And this sets up, this is God being sovereign over the governmental affairs of Persia in order to set up the opportunity for this little girl to become queen of Persia and set this up. So God is guiding the king, he's guiding the Supreme Court, and he is guiding the entire kingdom of Persia to set it up for a new queen. So you see here, we don't have a story of a wife being stubborn or a wife being mad at her husband or not willing to be humiliated or what, oh, he's a drunken bum, I'm not going to do that.
She's not being abused in any way.
It doesn't seem so.
No.
He's basically saying, well, okay, my final banquet is winding up. It's time for a royal appearance of my royal queen, and she should show up with her crown.
You would think at some point she would be expecting this.
Oh, yeah. I think she was. And she had a party for all the women of the province. So she had been hostessing this big party there. But we don't know what her motivation was. But the point of the author is that this created a governmental issue. And what the king needed to reside over this huge kingdom was a queen who showed respect for her position and respect for his position and respect for the government, the laws of the government. And he's going to get that in Queen Esther. And we're going to see that next week when we go into this, seeing Esther's reaction. And we're going to look for some hints about the kind of person Esther was, the kind of woman Esther was. And we'll see that next week. I hope you guys have enjoyed this. We'll continue this story next week. Today we've been talking about Queen Vashti's refusal to obey the law and refusal to obey the king, refusal to do her governmental duties as the queen. And I hope this has given us some things to think about. I want to make a recommendation of a video. It's called The Mutual Actions of Husbands and Wives in Their Marriages. It's out of the book of 1 Peter. I think you'll find it interesting. And I hope this has been a blessing to you. Come back next week and we'll see you in the book of Esther.